We have to fix this right now.
On the morning of her wedding rehearsal, Dr. Elena Robert woke up next to the man she believed she would spend the rest of her life with, completely unaware that within 48 hours, she would be standing in a hospital hallway removing his ring from her finger, holding a secret in her hands that would tear apart her family, end a man's career, and expose a cover-up that had already cost one person their life. This is a true storytelling account of what happened inside one of Chicago's busiest hospitals during the worst 48 hours of Elena Roberts' life, and the two sisters whose bond nearly didn't survive it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Elena Robert was 34 years old, and by every measure that mattered in her world, she had already won. She was the chief cardiothoracic surgeon at Mercy General, the youngest in the hospital's history to hold that title. Her hands were steady in a way that made even the most seasoned nurses trust her without hesitation. In surgeries where a single wrong movement meant the difference between a patient walking out of the hospital or never waking up again. She had graduated at the top of her class, published research before she turned 30, and built a reputation so solid that colleagues twice her age deferred to her judgment in the operating room without question. She was engaged to Dr. Marcus Chen, Mercy General's star trauma surgeon, a man so composed under pressure that families receiving the worst news of their lives often left his office thanking him for his honesty. Together, Elena and Marcus were the closest thing the hospital had to royalty. Nobody in that building could have guessed how quickly it would all come apart. 2 floors below Elena's office, a young nurse named Elena Robert clocked in for another 12-hour shift, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with patient charts or medication schedules. Camila was 29, 4 years into her nursing career, skilled enough that doctors specifically requested her on their most difficult cases. But in the Robert family, skill had never been the currency that mattered. Comparison was. Camila had grown up watching her older sister collect every award, every ounce of praise, every proud look from their parents, while she stood a half step behind, introduced at family gatherings not by her own accomplishments, but as an afterthought to Elena's. She told herself for years that it didn't bother her anymore. She told herself a lot of things. One of them was that she wasn't in love with her sister's fiancé. She had been telling herself that particular lie for almost 2 years, and on the morning this story begins, she still believed she could keep telling it forever. What Camila never admitted to anyone, not even herself in her most honest moments, was how it started. It wasn't dramatic, it was small. A conversation in the surgeon's lounge after a brutal double shift, when Marcus noticed she hadn't eaten in 14 hours and quietly handed her half of his sandwich without turning it into a moment. A late night after they had lost a patient together, when he let his composure slip just long enough for her to see him rest his head against the wall and simply breathe, something he never allowed himself to do in front of Elena. Marcus made Camila feel seen in a way her own family rarely had. And the guilt of that, of feeling more understood by her sister's fiancé than by her own sister, wore on her slowly, over months, the way water wears down stone until nobody remembers what the surface used to look like. 18 months before this story truly begins, that quiet feeling led Camila to make a decision she would spend the rest of her life trying to undo. It happened during a night shift no one else was around for. Marcus came to her pale and shaking, in a state she had never seen him in, not even during the hospital's worst traumas. A patient of his, a man named Richard Halston, had died on the operating table during a procedure that should have been routine. Marcus insisted the outcome was unavoidable, a rare and tragic complication with nothing to do with his own technique. But the documentation told a different story. A medication order had been entered late. A critical allergy flag had been missed somewhere in the system. Marcus begged Camila for help, not to falsify anything, he told her, only to quietly correct a charting error before it reached the review board, an error that would otherwise unfairly end the career of a young nurse who hadn't actually caused Richard Halston's death. Camila believed him completely. She loved him, even if she had never once said the word aloud, and she wanted, more than anything, to believe that the man she cared about would never ask her to do something wrong. So she made the correction he asked for. What she didn't understand, not for another 18 months, was that the adjustment she made didn't protect an innocent nurse from an unfair mistake at all. It erased the evidence that the real error belonged to Marcus himself, a rushed decision made under pressure, quietly buried under a story that nearly let someone else take the blame for a man's death. Elena Robert had unknowingly helped the man she loved cover up the death of a patient, and she had no idea, not yet. That knowledge was still 18 months away, waiting for a single ordinary morning to bring it crashing into the light. On the morning this story truly begins, none of it had surfaced yet. Elena was reviewing her surgical schedule with her usual precision, unaware that her fiancé was carrying a secret that would end everything between them. Marcus was reviewing wedding seating charts with visibly less enthusiasm than a groom should have 3 weeks before his own wedding. Camila was 3 cups of coffee deep, trying not to think about either of them, trying to hold on to the version of her life where the secret she carried would simply stay buried forever. None of the 3 of them had any idea that 40 miles away, on a rain-slicked interstate just outside the city, a semi-truck was moments away from jackknifing across 6 lanes of morning traffic, an event that would, within the hour, force every hidden truth inside Mercy General into a single unbearable spotlight none of them could escape. The call came in at 8:47 that morning. A multi-vehicle collision, more than 20 people injured, several in critical condition, every available surgeon and trauma team ordered to report immediately. Within minutes, the entire hospital transformed. Gurneys lined the emergency room hallway faster than rooms could be cleared. Overhead pages rang out over one another in overlapping urgency. Elena scrubbed in for what would become the first of 6 consecutive emergency surgeries that day. Marcus ran triage in the emergency room, making split-second decisions about who could wait and who could not survive waiting. Camila moved between ICU beds as though she had 4 pairs of hands instead of 2, running IV lines, calming terrified patients, relaying vital signs to doctors who barely had time to look up from what was in front of them. For the first several hours, there was no room left for jealousy, no room for guilt, no room for anything except the next patient, and the one after that, and the one after that. But a crisis does not erase what people are carrying inside them. It only delays it. And somewhere around the 18th hour of that shift, the delay finally ran out. Among the patients brought in that morning was an elderly man named John Halston, 78 years old, pulled from a car that had been struck broadside in the collision. He had internal bleeding, several fractures, and a heart already weakened by decades of hard living. Camila was assigned to his bedside once he stabilized enough to leave surgery, and it was there, holding his hand as the sedation began to wear off, that John said something that would change the entire shape of the night ahead of her. He asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, to see his son before anything else happened to him. He said the name Daniel, and he said please, and Camila promised she would try, the way nurses everywhere make that promise constantly, not always knowing if it can be kept. When Camila pulled up John Halston's file to search for contact information, something made her stomach drop entirely. Daniel Halston was listed as next of kin, estranged, no contact in 11 years. But beneath that entry, buried in an old scanned document from a previous hospital admission years earlier, was a name she recognized instantly, because she had typed it herself 18 months earlier, the night she helped Marcus adjust a medical chart. Richard Halston, John's other son, the man whose death Marcus's rushed decision had caused, and whose cover-up Camila had unknowingly helped create. The elderly man dying in the ICU bed in front of her was the father of a man whose truth had been buried by the very hospital now trying to save his life. And Camila was the only person standing in that hallway who understood exactly what that meant. She stood frozen at the nurse's station for a long moment, the file trembling slightly in her hands. 18 months of quiet guilt suddenly had a face attached to it, 2 faces actually. Richard's, whom she had never met but had unknowingly helped erase from the truth, and now John's, dying slowly down the hall, begging for a reunion with the one son he had left, with no idea that his other son's death had been quietly buried by the same hospital he was now trusting to save him. Camila thought seriously about walking away and letting the secret stay buried, the way it had stayed buried for a year and a half already. But then she thought about her sister, about Elena, brilliant and driven, and utterly devoted to a man Camila now understood, with sickening clarity, she did not actually know at all. Camila found Elena in the surgical corridor between her fourth and fifth emergency operations of the night, drenched in exhaustion, already scrubbing back in for another patient who could not wait. She told her sister she needed to say something, and that she didn't think there would ever be a good time for it, so she was saying it now. Elena listened, still in her surgical cap, as Camila told her everything. The favor Marcus had asked, the chart correction that wasn't what it seemed, the dead man named Richard Halston, and the father now lying in the ICU asking for the son he had left, with no idea what had really happened to the one he had lost. For a long moment, Elena said absolutely nothing at all. Then, quietly, she asked her sister the question that had been sitting underneath everything Camila had just confessed. She asked how long Camila had been in love with him. Camila's mouth opened and closed and opened again, because there was no version of an answer that didn't hurt somebody. She said 2 years, and she said she had never once acted on it, and she swore to her sister that she never would have. Elena told her she believed her, and she meant it, because underneath the shock, underneath the sudden vertigo of everything she thought she knew about her fiancé collapsing at once, she finally understood something about her sister's loneliness inside their own family that she had never let herself see clearly before. It had never really been about jealousy toward Elena at all. It had been about needing, desperately, for someone, anyone, to see her the way their own parents never fully had. And Marcus had seen her that clearly. That was the tragedy underneath everything. He had understood Camila well enough to know exactly how to use that understanding. Elena confronted Marcus in the surgeon's lounge less than an hour later, her scrub still stained from her last surgery, her hands unsteady for the first time all night. Marcus did not deny a single piece of it. Exhausted after 18 straight hours of trauma work, stripped of the composure he usually wore so easily, he confirmed everything: the rushed decision that killed Richard Halston, the panic that followed it, the request he made of Camila, and the 1.5 years he had spent burying it all, under the quiet assumption that no one would ever connect the pieces. He told Elena he never meant for anyone to get hurt, not Richard, not Camila, not her. There was no defense that could follow that sentence, and Marcus didn't try to offer one. Elena removed her engagement ring in that lounge that night, 3 weeks before what was supposed to be her wedding day, and set it down on the counter between them without saying another word. While Elena's world was quietly collapsing in the surgeon's lounge, Camila spent her remaining hours on shift, doing the one thing she still had the power to control. She worked the phones relentlessly, tracking down Daniel Halston, John's estranged son, through old records and a decade-cold trail, until she finally reached a cousin in Ohio who still kept in touch with him. Daniel answered on the 4th ring, groggy and wary of a stranger calling at 2 a.m. Camila told him his father was at Mercy General, that he had been in an accident, that he was asking for him, and that she didn't know how much time remained, and she hadn't wanted him to spend the rest of his life wondering if anyone had tried to reach him. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. 11 years of estrangement does not dissolve in a single phone call, but grief and fear and the particular ache of something unfinished have a way of cutting through even the oldest wounds. Daniel finally said he was coming. He arrived at Mercy General 4 hours later, having driven through the night without stopping once. Camila walked him to his father's room herself and stood in the doorway as John Halston, weak and fading, opened his eyes to see the son he hadn't spoken to in over a decade standing beside his bed. Daniel said, "Dad," his voice breaking on the single word. John whispered that he had come, that he hadn't believed he actually would. Daniel told him he should have come a long time ago, and took his father's hand. Camila stepped quietly out of the room and let the door close behind her, and finally allowed herself to cry, after 18 straight hours of holding everything together for everyone else around her. She hadn't been able to undo what had happened to Richard, but she had given this family back the one thing that was still possible to save. In the days that followed, Elena did what her sister had been too afraid to do 18 months earlier. She brought the truth about Richard Halston's case directly to the hospital review board herself. It cost Marcus his position at Mercy General entirely. An internal investigation confirmed everything Elena and Camila already knew, that the medical error had been his alone, that the chart correction Camila had unknowingly assisted with had obscured the truth, and that Richard Halston's family deserved, at the very least, an honest account of what had actually happened to him. Camila did not escape consequence either. She faced her own disciplinary review for altering the record, even unknowingly. But when the board heard the full context, a mistake made out of loyalty to a man who had deliberately misled her, followed 18 months later by her own choice to come forward the moment she understood the truth, she was permitted to keep her position, on probation, with mandatory retraining. It was not a clean ending, real ones rarely are, but it was an honest one, and after everything both sisters had lived through, honest was the thing they had been missing most. The hardest conversation of all didn't happen inside the hospital. It happened weeks later, at their parents' kitchen table, the same table where Camila had spent years watching Elena's accomplishments celebrated while her own were quietly overlooked. This time, it was Elena who spoke first. She told her sister she had been so wrapped up in being good at her job that she had never once stopped to ask whether Camila felt like she mattered less, and that she had, and that Elena had let that happen because it had always been easier not to notice it. Camila cried, not the exhausted tears of a brutal shift, but something far older, something she had been carrying since childhood. She said she never wanted to resent her sister, she just never knew how to stop. Elena told her she didn't have to anymore, that she had never been the footnote in their family, and that Elena should have said so a long time ago. For the first time in years, the two sisters were not standing on opposite sides of a comparison neither of them had ever asked for. They were simply sisters, imperfect and honest, finally seeing each other clearly. Throughout the chaos of that 48-hour crisis, there had been one more person quietly holding the pieces together without ever asking for anything in return. Dr. Owen Williams, an emergency room physician, had worked alongside Elena through all 6 of her surgeries that night. He was the one who brought her coffee she never asked for during a 4-minute gap between patients. He was the one who covered 2 extra hours of her shift without being asked, so she could sit with Camila after the truth about Marcus finally surfaced. He never once mentioned the engagement ring that had quietly disappeared from her hand. Owen wasn't dramatic, and he wasn't the kind of headline couple Marcus and Elena had once been. He was steady, in the kind of way that only becomes obvious after you've lived through its opposite. It took nearly 2 months after that terrible night before Elena finally let herself notice it clearly. She was staying late one evening, charting after a routine surgery, when Owen came by with 2 coffees the way he always did, and asked, the way he always did, if she needed anything at all. This time, she looked up and really looked at him. She asked why he had been doing this for 2 months straight, bringing her coffee, covering her shifts, never asking for a single thing in return. Owen shrugged, a little embarrassed and a little brave at the same time, and told her he had watched her hold an entire hospital together during the worst night it had seen in years, and somehow she still showed up every single day afterward and did it all over again, so he figured someone should hold a little of that weight for her, for once. Elena didn't answer him with words. She answered by finally, quietly, allowing herself to want something good again. Richard Halston's family eventually received a full and honest account of what had happened to him, not the version buried inside an altered chart, but the truth, delivered with the accountability it should have carried from the very beginning. It didn't undo their loss, nothing ever could, but it gave them something the silence had never allowed them to have, the ability to finally grieve without a lie sitting underneath it. John Halston recovered from his injuries slowly, over the following months, with his son Daniel at his side for every step of it. Camila visited them both on her days off long after her professional obligation to the case had technically ended, because some bonds formed in crisis simply don't dissolve just because the paperwork closes behind them. Marcus left Chicago entirely, and whatever happened to him after that isn't really part of this story. Some people's endings are simply the space they leave behind for everyone else to finally heal into. A year after the crash that changed everything, Mercy General held its annual staff gathering, the kind of evening where exhausted doctors and nurses put on formal clothes for a few hours and pretend, if only briefly, that their jobs don't cost them as much as they actually do. Elena walked in that night with Owen at her side, not as a headline hospital power couple, but as two people who had built something slower, steadier, and far more honest than anything she had ever had before him. Camila walked in separately, standing taller than she had in years, greeted by colleagues who knew her now not as the surgeon's sister, but simply as Camila, the nurse who ran her unit with a steadiness that made every patient trust her the moment she walked into the room. The two sisters found each other across the room the way they always eventually did, and sat together at a table near the back, away from the noise, the way they used to as children sneaking away from their parents' own parties years earlier. Camila asked her sister if she ever thought about that night, the crash, all of it. Elena considered the question for a long moment before answering. She said she thought about it every single day, that it had been the worst night of her entire career, and that somehow it was also the reason she finally had everything sitting in front of her now, gesturing not only toward Owen across the room, but toward Camila seated right beside her, toward the truth, toward the version of their family that finally felt honest for the first time in either of their lives. Camila said it was funny how that worked out. Elena smiled and told her it wasn't funny at all. It was simply true. Outside the hospital, the city moved on the way it always did. Ambulances arriving through the night, patients being wheeled through doors in every direction, doctors and nurses beginning shifts that would ask everything of them all over again before the sun came up. But inside, for one single night, two sisters sat quietly side by side, finally seeing each other clearly, finally home.